Jeff Wenninger, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
I've had a couple of LAPD and LA County sheriffs on my show, not too many. So this is good. I like to get some West Coast perspective. I ordinarily don't get a lot of West Coast coppers, but I'm very happy to have you on the show. And if you're interested, those who are listening or watching or both, Kathy Bennett was on an episode way back, like 3.5 years ago, in episode 33. So she gave a pretty good lowdown on the LAPD. Then I had Cliff Yates and Danny Smith that were both they did their careers with the LA County Sheriff's Department. So if you're interested in that, go back and check those out. I think that'd be pretty cool. But let's start out at the beginning here, Jeff. I was going through your bio and you were adopted, as a child. How did this affect your later life, especially in your career as a police officer? Or did it?
Well, just the fact that I was adopted in and of itself, I would say had very little impact on it. It's the people that adopted me.
Right.
I was um, born to a teenage mother, and she put me up for adoption. And I lived in a foster home for a short period of time before being placed in my parents' home. And they were married 12 years, and their ultimate goal was to have four children, each 1 year apart. And as life often has it, my mother became pregnant with my oldest sister about the time they were approved for adoption. But they didn't know if it was going to be
Surprise.
another, yeah, they didn't know if it was going to be another 12 years before they got pregnant again. So they went
Yeah.
ahead and through the adoption process. They adopted me, and then they adopted my brother, who's half Japanese. And then I had a foster sister who's African American.
Okay.
And I was born and raised in Kent, Ohio. And my father was a sociology professor at Kent State, which is infamous for the May 4th shooting, four dead in Ohio, where the National Guard shot and killed four students. And that was kind of the environment that I grew up in. So it's not necessarily the fact that of in and of itself being adopted that had such an impact on me. It was the type of values that my parents instilled in me growing up that kind of influenced how I viewed my law enforcement career.
Yeah, I could see. I was just thinking that, you might have a little more empathy or insight than like I would. Not coming from that environment. It's like obviously us cops we deal a lot with misplaced children, foster care, the state, or the county that, places children that, it's 2 o'clock in the morning and you got to arrest mom or whoever, or whatever the situation is, and you got to find a home for this kid. So, I mean, I would think you have a little more insight than the average bear, than like say I would, and I think that would be a help, in a police career.
Well, one thing that was interesting was that growing up and being a young boy, when I think back, I don't have any recollection of seeing my foster sister as a black girl or my brother as a Japanese boy. It just didn't doesn't resonate with you when you're 2, 3, 4, 5 years
Sure.
old. It's your siblings who play, get along, and sometimes argue and fight. And that's how you see it. And it gives you a different paradigm in which you look at how we form our beliefs and our attitudes relative to race. And, and also being in a multiracial family, I was exposed to what I would call kind of microaggressions of racism,
Okay.
where it's not overt, but, people with the veneer of a smile would say things. I'll
Okay.
give you an example. I remember being at a grocery store with my mother, and the four of us were with her, and this woman comes up with a big grin on her face, and she says, "Oh, your children look all so much alike." And I mean, at the time, I was too young and too naive to
Sure.
understand what that was all about. But my mother, she carried herself with great poise and grace and just ignored the comment. We carried on with our day, not allowing it to interrupt our daily activities. But it was those sorts of things that I was exposed to that makes me just perhaps a little bit more in tune or have a larger global perspective of some of the sociological issues facing our society,
Yeah.
which then in turn faces law enforcement. And it just gave me a wealth of exposure to things that the average person isn't exposed to.
Yeah, I could see that. Now, I'm thinking about Kent State. Obviously, that was quite an event in our history. Was your dad working when all that happened, when the shooting, started and all that?
Yeah, actually, he was like I said, he's a sociology professor.
Yeah.
And the night before the shooting, the ROTC building was burnt down. It was that was on the
Oh, that's right.
adjacent to the
Yep.
common. And the my father's office was in Lowry Hall, which is right adjacent to the
Oh my
common.
gosh.
So he actually had walked over. If you look at some photographs of the moment in which the guardsmen are firing, you'll see that behind them is a building. That's Johnson Hall. It's a dormitory. And there's a
Yeah.
number of people standing on top of that over the shoulders of the guardsmen. One of them is my father. So he
Wow.
actually,
You know who else was there? Chrissy Hine from the Pretenders,
yeah, yeah,
the lead
yeah.
singer for the Pretenders. She's from Kent. Yeah, and she was at Kent State when all that kicked off.
Yeah, she
So
used to work at a greasy spoon
yeah.
breakfast. It was a train car that was turned into a greasy
Oh,
spoon
cool.
place.
Well, I just gotta save that because yeah, that's one of my favorite bands. I've seen them in concert a bunch of times, and I saw her. The only remaining member that's original is the drummer, and I don't even know if he's still with them, but she's there, and for her age, man, she could belt it out. She could still just kick ass. It's amazing to me. I mean, she's the real deal. There's no doubt about it. But yeah, she's got a biography. I don't know if you've ever read it. I think you'd be fascinated by it with your background. I think it's My Life as a Pretender or something like that. And oh, it's amazing. That's one of my favorite books. I thought, it's like I like rock and roll biographies and all that. And boy, whew, she she had quite the upbringing. But yeah, so you know, you're going on growing up. You're a hockey player and you got a scholarship to go to college. Now, I have special insight to that because my son, my oldest boy, was a big time hockey player. And he was in line to do great things with hockey. And he had to quit when he was 16 because he had 5 concussions in 3 years. He was done. But,
Yeah, I could.
I lived at the ice rink. I sympathize and empathize with your parents, because that is not a cheap sport whatsoever, and it's a time suck. Oh my God, it is amazing. So, you're this college hockey guy, and you get to college on a hockey scholarship. Did you think your career in hockey, molded you and prepared you for your life later on? Some of the positive attributes.
Well, it certainly did. I mean, because what I applied to my hockey career were the values that my parents instilled in me, which was you always try the best you possibly can at anything you try to achieve, and don't accept mediocrity. So I was always pushing my limits and trying to excel in ice hockey, and I was very passionate about that. And I took that into my hockey career. And ultimately, I started back when I was in like fourth grade. I played on a AAA traveling team,
Wow,
and I played the guys were older than me. They were 3 years older than me. So I was
holy heck!
playing, and we traveled all over, the United States and Canada and playing in
Oh yeah,
tournaments and whatnot. And, we had 12 players, two goaltenders and two lines. And we actually, out of that, I think 7 guys played Division I college hockey. One made it to the NHL. So we
wow.
were we were a quite talented group of individuals, young men. And I left home when I was 16 and played junior hockey in Canada. And then the following year, I played for the Dubuque Fighting Saints in Iowa, Dubuque, Iowa, and in the United States Hockey League. And it was from there that I earned my scholarship. And I chose a scholarship to play at Western Michigan. And I played at Western Michigan, and then I transferred to Kent State and finished out my hockey career there. But I too had to end my career earlier than I anticipated I would. I blew out my left shoulder and ultimately had to have a Bristol procedure where a screw was placed into it. It's now since been replaced. I have an anatomic full shoulder replacement, and
Oh,
then I
that's no fun.
blew. Then I recovered from that. And then I was playing and just getting back into my stride, and I blew out my left knee, and I had to have surgery for that.
Oh
So,
gosh.
it all caught up with me. So my career, I more than likely would have a fairly formidable professional career had I not sustained the injuries that I sustained.
Did you ever go to Shattuck St. Mary up in
Shattuck,
Minnesota?
No, I've heard of it, but no. Mm.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's high school, but they also have camps, like in the summertime. That's where Wayne Gretzky sent his kids. That's if you're a hockey protege, that's where you go, and that's my kid went there for summer camps, and it was an old Civil War encampment up in Minnesota, and it's nothing but hockey. Like if you these parents buy homes just so their kids can go to school there, and they
Right,
live there for 4 years, and each kid has a tutor because they travel so much. Their high school experience is much different than like the normal kids. But again, those are prodigies. Most of them go to the NFL. I mean NHL. You know they
right.
they really blow up. As far as that goes, it's an incubator for pro. And I'm just
Yeah.
I didn't realize any of this stuff until my kids started playing. I'm just like,
Yeah, when I
wow.
when I was young, I would go to Guelph, Ontario, to the Can-Am hockey school there.
Okay.
And, and then ultimately, the United States Hockey League at the time, that was the developmental league for prospective Division I collegiate hockey players and professional hockey players here in the United States.
Yeah.
And it's come a long way. I mean, it's much more elite now than it
Mm,
was back then. They actually have a national team that plays in that league, and those guys all go on and have formidable professional careers.
yeah. It's something else. I think it's a great, like you said, I think it's a great building block. It teaches a lot. Just team sports in general, I think is great for kids. And just that builds it even more. I think. It just I don't know. I enjoyed the time. You get to know the parents, that's for sure, because you spend a whole lot of time together. That becomes very encompassing. But yeah. So, as a young man, there was an incident where you had a negative interaction with the police, where you actually got arrested. I have a similar story to that, but I want to hear your story first.
Well, I was 20 years old, and it was Labor Day weekend. And at the urging of a hockey buddy of mine, we went out to a bar, and we ended up staying until closing. And as it was closing, everybody that was inside was filtering out onto the sidewalk, which was too narrow and not large enough for everybody to be on. So people started to fall into the street, and that's where my buddy and I ended up. There was a car with four young ladies in it, and my friend, I'm not quite sure what motivated him,
Yeah,
but he thought it'd be funny if he propped himself up on the hood of their car.
I'm
The
guessing
driver
alcohol. That's my guess. That's my guess.
I think the girls were rather attractive, and
Okay.
back then we didn't have social media and stuff. So if you saw somebody you thought was attractive, you went for it. So I think he was trying to be flirtatious, but it
Okay.
didn't go over very well. So when he fell off the hood of the car, he snapped off the antenna, and this was back when the antennas were on the hood.
Oh yes,
And
yes I know.
yeah, there was a police officer that was up the way that saw the whole thing. And he came down and he grabbed my buddy and put him in handcuffs and placed him in the back seat of the police car. So I'm thinking, well, okay, we're kind of on a buddy system. I got to find out where they're taking him, how long it's going to take to process him, and how much money is it going to take to get him out of jail. So I went up to approach the officer who was standing in the street next to his police vehicle, and he was rather belligerent with me, and used a number of expletives and basically
Okay.
told me to back up on the sidewalk or I was going to jail as well. So I'd been drinking, but I had my wits about me and I
Yeah.
understood that. So I got back up on the sidewalk, and it wasn't long before two more police cars showed up, and I saw them walking towards me just after the initial officer that was on scene pointed me out. And that should have been some clue of what would come. But I had some sense of comfort because one of the individuals walking towards me was a sergeant, and I thought, well, a sergeant's going to have some reasonable bring some reasonableness to this
Right.
situation. And when they come up to me, they say, using an expletive, hey, expletive, let's see your identification. So I went to reach for my identification, and then they proceeded to beat me. And I was aware I didn't want to be perceived as being confrontational with them or fighting with them.
Right.
I just kind of assumed kind of like a squatting fetal position to protect myself.
Yeah.
Next thing I knew, I was in handcuffs being driven down to to the police jail, the city jail. And when I get there, I ask the whereabouts of my buddy, and they said, "Oh, we let him go." And yeah, and I got arrested for disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, and interfering in official business. And I'm like, I
Wow.
didn't do anything.
Right.
So, you know, I that whole summer I had worked for the city of Kent water treatment plant. And I'm like, I'm gonna have to spend my entire earnings on an attorney because I wasn't going to take any of the plea deals that they were offering me because
What
I
did they
was
offer
steady.
you? Do you remember?
I don't remember all the details, but
Okay.
I would have been, basically saying that I had done wrong. And I'm like, I didn't do anything wrong.
Sure.
So I took it all the way to a jury trial. And that's when
Wow.
they came and said, listen, if you sign this ticket in Ohio, it's called like a minor misdemeanor. It's like a traffic ticket.
Yeah,
Is
like
a
an ordinance
$60
violation.
fine. Yeah. It's a citation, a $60 fine. If you sign this, then we'll drop the three charges. And I said, fair enough. And there it ended. So then you can't make up some stuff that happens in life. But about a year and a half later, there was an advertisement where the city police department was hiring correction officers for their city jail. And kind of out of a joke, I applied. I got hired. If that wasn't the ultimate exoneration of any wrongdoing, um, I don't know what is. I was now working for the law enforcement agency that had actually beaten and arrested me. You know, so
Did
it,
you
it,
ever
it
bump
was,
into those cops that you
but
had
yeah,
to run?
actually, it was actually quite strange because the sergeant that I spoke of earlier,
Yeah.
he had now promoted to lieutenant, and he was my boss. And you know, I learned actually to like him, quite like him. He had a very good sense of humor, and I liked the guy from a personal standpoint. And there was one time he called me into the office, and we just had some basic little banter going on back and
Yeah.
forth. And then he did bring up the night of my arrest, and he
Yeah.
explained to me that police officers, that when they identify somebody that potentially could escalate the situation when you have that many people, college students that have been drinking in the area, that we're going to make an example of you. And that's what happened. And I accepted that explanation. But to be honest with you, that was kind of my first exposure to what I call that slippery slope, that the end justifies the means,
Right.
where try to control the law enforcement tries to control situations through brute force, when it's not actually justified. But like I said, I liked the guy, and I would have a beer with him. Even
That's
today, I
interesting.
would.
Yeah, because I was in charge. We had a tavern car, and I was in charge of it. It's a license. We call it the tavern car. It was a licensed premise car. I worked it as a cop, and then later on as a sergeant, I was in charge of it. And I've been in the middle of, I just call them like mini riots, where it's me and maybe two or three cops, and there's over, I don't know, 150, 200 people going crazy in the streets. And these aren't college kids. Usually what I'd have to worry about is getting shot in these neighborhoods that I was working at. When things went sideways, they really went sideways. And boy, I'm not condoning what they did to you, but I do understand the feeling of being completely outnumbered and thinking, oh man, this can really turn ugly really, really fast. But that's when though you have to keep a cool head, and you really, really have to pick your battles. Even if somebody is breaking some minor ordinance or law or whatever, it's like, do you really want to jump into that crowd and hook them up? Yeah, it's by yourself, or backup. Is at least 5 or 10 minutes away. You're like, is that the fight I want to fight today? So you got to ask yourself that. So yeah, I empathize with you on that. And when I was a kid, we moved from Chicago to Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin, this little town, in the boonies. It was like maybe 10,000 people. I was a freshman in high school. And I wasn't aware there was this animosity that Wisconsin people had towards Illinois people. Well, you're all rich. Both my parents are immigrants. They came to this country with nothing. We're far, far from rich. My dad got a job transfer. That's why we're coming up here. And it was just, hey, we hate Chicago people, especially Chicago people. And I'm like, I didn't even know that was a thing. And later on, I get my driver's license. I have the 68 Plymouth Fury. I'm coming from band practice. and I have a girl sitting next to me. This those old cars you could sit four people across. There was no hump in there weren't bucket seats. They were big old bench seats. And she's sitting next to me, and I got the cars loaded with my friends. I take a corner too fast. I start fishtailing. It was raining, wet leaves, blah blah blah. And the girl next to me that I wanted to date puts her leg over and hits the accelerator instead of the brake. So I plow into some teacher's brand new station wagon and total it. Well, police officer comes and he's just shaking his head, and I'm like, I didn't say she did it. I was noble. I said, hey, you know what? The car fishtailed, went out of control. I hit this car. My fault. And he's like, uh huh, uh huh. So I did not know that this girl was the fire chief's daughter. And I'm like, oh, okay. Well, now all of a sudden, I've got this police officer following me home from school every day, literally
Hmm.
every day. I'm like, I feel like I'm in a parade or something. I've got a police escort now. And later on, like maybe 6 months, down the road, I get into another car accident. I got my mom's car. She had a 72 Super Beetle. I'm pulling out of a gas station. It's snowing out really bad, blah, blah, blah. And I see this Oldsmobile Tornado. I remember all the car makes. And it's just barreling like 100 miles an hour at me. I'm like, oh shit. So she clips my back bumper. I go spinning like a top. Same officer responds. I'm like, oh, it's my lucky day. So he gets out of the car. The first thing he does is fall on his ass. He slips on the ice. And I'm trying not to laugh. And he's just giving me that look. And he walks over to us and he's like, I know you. Ma'am, could I have your driver's license? She said, officer, just so you know, this is totally my fault. I was going way over the speed limit. I could not stop. She's blah blah blah, and he's like, no, it's his fault. I'm like, huh? No, shut up. It's your fault. Be quiet or you're going to jail. And I'm just like, all right. So, I mean, I could tell you story after story. I felt like I was in Footloose without the dancing or the Baptist stuff. So, it was crazy. But yeah, it's a rotten feeling when you got the cops against you and you have your own personal cop that is like, all right, I'm going to make your life miserable. And I didn't think that stuff even existed. I'm from Chicago. I mean, I saw what the Chicago police did, and I had nothing but respect for them and a good chunk of fear as well. And I never experienced anything like this or anybody in my family. I'm like, boy, but did your incident ever come up in your backgrounds when you became a police officer?
Well, I did disclose it, so
Yeah.
absolutely the background investigator looked into it. But when I worked for the city of Kent Police Department, I had an upstanding reputation. They liked me there. They actually would have loved to have had me apply and been a police officer there. But I was looking to go to a large law enforcement agency where I
Okay.
felt I could get the type of experience that I was looking to get. Because ultimately, I had no intention on staying in law enforcement for 33 years. My intention was to be a professor of criminal justice. And
Okay.
just as my father was in academia, I wanted to follow his footsteps into academia. And prior to getting my PhD, he encouraged me to go get 5 years of practical experience at a large law enforcement agency and then come back. And he
Ah.
said that it'll enrich your studies. It'll make you a much more credible professor.
Oh yeah.
And that's what my ultimate goal was when I went out to Los Angeles. I had no intention on staying for 33 years.
Well, yeah, I was looking at your pictures that was sent over to me with your bio, and it's so Adam 12 and TJ Hooker. Oh my gosh, the uniform, the squad. I love it. I mean, it's iconic. It's very, very iconic. It's very, it's like, oh yeah, that's LAPD. You know right away. I mean, there ain't no big mystery to that. Did you ever watch those shows?
I used to watch Adam 12, yeah. And actually, Adam 12, at the beginning of the start of the show, they would show the black and white going down the ramp from the top parking lot
Yes.
at the old Rampart station.
Oh, I didn't know that was
And
Rampart. Okay.
yeah, and I worked Rampart. I worked there as a sergeant. I ran the gang unit there after the Rafael Perez LAPD crash scandal, and I
Wow.
was I was brought in to clean up that the gang unit. So,
Interesting.
but it was kind of interesting. I actually worked at many of the very famous buildings for the LAPD. One
Oh,
of
is
them
that
being
cool?
Rampart. I worked the 77th Division, which is a very nostalgic station that has since been torn down and a new one built. And I worked at the old Parker Center, which was named after Chief Parker, and it has since been torn down, and a whole new police headquarters has been built a block away. But I did have the opportunity to work at those three prestigious LAPD buildings.
Now, did you apply for like say New York or Chicago, any other large departments, or you just wanted to be LAPD?
Well, I did. I had no desire really to be that far from Ohio,
Yeah,
but so I did. I tested with Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Akron here in Ohio, some suburbs of Cleveland, and I got on the hiring list, but they weren't hiring because
okay.
in the late 80s, early 90s, there was kind of a recession here in the Midwest.
Right.
But out in Los Angeles, they were hiring hand over fist. And
Oh,
I
okay.
applied with both the LAPD and the LA County Sheriffs as a backup because my desire was to be LAPD. And what influenced that was the movie Colors
Oh
with
yeah,
Sean Penn.
absolutely. I love that movie.
Yeah, that was out when I was in college, and I remember watching that movie. I've watched it multiple times back when I was younger, and I was just like, LAPD is just a cut above everybody else. You know, from what I'm getting from that movie. I mean,
Right,
it's
right.
kind of ridiculous to think that that's how I thought at the time, but I was just very impressed with how they look in uniform, how professional they were, and the reputation LAPD had because LAPD was the one that actually started SWAT and special weapons and tactics.
Yep.
And that trickled down into all the training that the rest of the department gets. So as far as the tactical training you get in the Los Angeles Police Department, it at times can be argued that it's superior to anywhere else you may be working. So that's what influenced me to choose Los Angeles. But
Okay.
I ultimately chose initially, I wanted to go with LAPD, but I ended up going with the LA County Sheriffs for a couple reasons. Um, First and foremost, that when I was going through the process, I was at police headquarters and a sergeant that was working in the recruitment and hiring section for the LAPD sees me and he goes, I see that you've been hired by the LA County Sheriff's Department. I said, yes, sir, I have. And he goes, you're a fool if you don't take that job. We used to be better, but we're not any longer. And I
Oh,
thought, interesting.
yeah.
So then to give you another experience that I had was when I was going through the testing process with the LA County Sheriffs, I was doing the physical fitness test and I met a gentleman who whose father had been a retired sergeant from the LAPD. And he said, my father wouldn't even let me apply for LAPD. And I'm
Wow.
like, why is that? And he goes, why don't you come on over and, meet my father and you can ask
Yeah.
him yourself. So I took him up on that. I figured I might as well, hear it from the source. And, he had views on affirmative action and felt that he had been limited in his opportunities because he was a white male and those sorts of things. So here I was a young man and having these two experiences where you had an insider and somebody had recently retired
Yeah.
that were speaking very poorly of the organization. So that influenced me to start considering the sheriff's department, more seriously than I had initially, where it was just kind of like a backup plan if things didn't work out with the LAPD. But I ended up choosing to go with the sheriff's, and that turned out to be a good thing because the largest place I had lived prior to moving to Los Angeles was Dubuque, Iowa, population 62,000. So
Okay.
you go out to Los Angeles, you have 6 lanes going one direction on a freeway.
Wow.
My
Yeah.
palms would be sweating. You had, a number of languages that were being spoken. It was like in a whole nother world to me.
Sure.
So really what it gave me was the ability to work in a controlled environment, the jails, because that's where your first
You
assignment after
started
you
out there,
go.
yeah.
That's where you start. So it gave me a little bit of time to try kind of acclimate not only to living there, but to the criminal element that I would be dealing with on a daily basis. So that it turned out to be a good thing. But, generally you would spend about a year in custody. But there was some slowdowns of transfers out. People were doing 5 and 6 years in custody,
Ooh.
and that was like doing a jail sentence of your own. And I just
Yeah, it
couldn't
is.
do it. So that's when I lateraled over to the LAPD in 1993.
Sweet. Now, I assume you had to go through the LAPD Academy then.
They had a lateral class,
They
so I went
did.
through.
No kidding.
Yeah,
With the
there was
sheriffs,
it
they had
was
an agreement, huh?
yeah there was an 8-week program where basically you just learned the unique policies and procedures of the LAPD. You had to demonstrate proficiency in pugilistics and grappling and defensive tactics, as well as firearms manipulation. But then that you got through that in 8 weeks, and you went out to a patrol.
Wow. Yeah, my hat is off to anybody who works in corrections because that is just such a to me, it's a horrible job. But you learn a lot of skills. You learn how to talk to people. If you didn't have that skill before, A, you're going to be in a lot of fights. You're just going to be one miserable puppy. Yeah, it just you don't have a weapon, backup is far away, and they don't have a weapon either. And and you're always outnumbered. Always. And you better learn how to talk to people because otherwise you're just going to have a miserable existence as a jailer if you don't know how. So I think that's a great training ground. And if you're not exposed to certain criminality, at least, yeah, now you're getting your toes in the water and you're like, oh, okay. And you're picking up on certain nuances, et cetera, et cetera. And you're like, oh, it's a good education. So I think you probably didn't think it at the time, but it was probably a very good thing that you started with the sheriffs and you did that time in the
Right.
jail.
It's there's kind of like a bell curve. You get to a
Yeah,
point where you maximize what you can benefit from working that type of assignment,
right.
and then it starts to wear on you,
Hmm.
where you psychologically can start viewing everybody as a criminal and that sort of thing
Oh
because
yeah,
you're dealing with criminals every day. That's why they're there. They're in custody because
right.
they are criminals. So it can, if you're in there for too long period of a time, it can impact how you view the people that you're interacting with after you get out. Because the vast majority of people you're going to be interacting with when you're working out in the field, they're not these hardcore criminals that you're dealing with in the jails. So you really need to change your approach to how you interact with people.
Yeah. So you go to LAPD. Where did you do your field training?
77th Division, which is down in South Los Angeles. That's
So,
where the riots broke out, Florence and Normandy.
okay.
Reginald Denver was hit over the head with the brick there. That's
Oh,
right smack dab in the center of of the division.
damn. Now, how does it work as far as, they don't call them FTOs or TOs, training officers, and how long were you on training like that, on field training?
Well, the city charter mandates a 18-month probation period. So you do your academy time, which is essentially 6 months.
6, yeah.
And then you had a phase two and phase three of your training. Phase two was your first 6 months out in patrol. And that's when you had a designated assigned training officer that had to sign you off on everything in your book to demonstrate that you were competent in all these various areas of knowledge and skill. And then when you got to your phase three, then there was a little more leniency in regards to how they could deploy you. You could work with other police officer twos. You didn't have to work with a field training officer. But mine was expedited because I was a lateral,
Okay,
so I was able to just get signed off on the book pretty straight away. And basically, my entire time there during my probation, I was, deployed as a regular police officer.
cool. Now, I'm thinking back, way back when I went through it as well. Do you remember when they let you out by yourself? Like the first time rolling out of the driveway as a cop in a squad car by yourself?
Well, that never happened in 77th Division
Oh, it
because
did not. Okay.
you don't deploy single officer units that are handling basic radio calls. You may have somebody that's out there, a report car that
Yeah,
would respond to burglaries that occurred the
sure.
day before, those sorts of things. But if you were going to be engaged in any type of observation work or responding to radio calls, you had a partner. So I didn't work alone until after I worked 77th Division. You have a mandatory transfer after you get off probation. It's
Oh, you
called the
do?
wheel transfer.
Oh,
And I
okay.
went to Central Traffic Division, which is a central bureau. So I was an accident investigator for the entire bureau
Hmm.
of the Central Bureau, which was comprised of 4 divisions.
Did you want to
And
do
then
that?
there you worked on. Oh, I did not. No,
Ah,
absolutely not.
but isn't that what the
Actually,
motorcycles do? Did they have regular cops doing it as well?
motorcycle cops were more traffic enforcement, and then you'd have the AI guys, accident investigators.
Yeah,
So I was, and really, when you're young, you're full of, wind piss and excitement. You want to be doing all the exciting
oh
things,
yeah.
adrenaline. flowing things. And there was an officer that I worked with, and he was a senior guy, and the transfer came out. And I remember working with him just a couple of days after the transfer came out, and I was telling him how disappointed I was in the fact that I was going to traffic because that's not what I wanted to do.
Right.
And he goes, "Listen, I'm going to explain something to you, and I hope you heed my advice." He goes, "At this juncture of your career, it has nothing to do with what assignment you're working. It's how you work that assignment. You're
Oh,
building your reputation. So
yes.
you go there and you be the best, absolute very best accident investigator you possibly can be. Take advantage of all the training, all the schools that they can send you to, and the expertise that you get. Because what you're going to have when you get out of there is an expertise level in something that a vast majority of people in this organization don't have. And you're going to actually be investigating homicides, where you have vehicular homicides, and
Yeah,
you're going to
absolutely.
the investigating officer on that." So he goes, "You take it for what it is." And I said, "You know what? He's right. He got my mind right." So I walked into that assignment with the right mindset and frame of mind that I was going to maximize what I could. So I went to basic AI school. I went to intermediate, AI school. I learned to, I went to school where I could, estimate. I was certified estimating speeds by just viewing cars
Mhm.
driving and things like that. I got all these various skill sets. And what it did help me with was when I became a field training officer, I had this skill where I could buy these traffic collisions, the calls when they come out, and I could train my
Oh, yeah.
probationer. Where had I not had that experience, I would have wanted. I'd be showing myself out code six somewhere, so I wouldn't get assigned the traffic collision that just was broadcast, because that's what guys would do if they don't feel comfortable doing something. They try to avoid it.
Oh,
But I was
absolutely.
extremely comfortable with it, so it turned out to be a great thing for me.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how different departments do things because, like, in Milwaukee, we have motorcycle cops, and their primary role is, traffic enforcement. They also do, motorcades and, all that kind of cool stuff. But they're also the traffic investigators. And there's a smaller unit within the motorcycles that are, all they do is, we call them 20 pointers, fatal car accidents, fatal traffic accidents. And I didn't realize all the work that went into that. They've got like surveyor tools and all this like crazy stuff. And there's a whole lot of math and physics going on. And that's way over my head. And they're getting search warrants every day. I didn't realize there's a black box in a car, like in an airplane. Yeah, this car was going, 62 and a half miles an hour. He didn't have his seatbelt on, blah, blah, blah. You need to hit the brake. I'm like, really? That's pretty freaking impressive. You got all that from this twisted piece of metal, you'd roll up on a scene and later on as a boss, and it's like, hey, here come the motorcycles. And I'm like, oh, I love you guys. You're the best. You make mine and my cops' lives so much better because that's all they do. They're so good at it. They can do, they can punch out an accident report, in like an hour where it take my guys 3 or 4 or 5 hours. And it's no
Right.
fault of their, it's just, it's reps, that's what they do for a living. And I, again, my hat's off to all the traffic investigator guys. I didn't realize it till later on that, yeah, you're doing homicide investigations. You're doing all kinds of high speed stuff, but at face value, it's not as sexy, especially if you're young. You're just like, I don't want to be doing this.
Yeah.
So,
It actually, I enjoyed it because to the point where I got to a point where I had the expertise where I could walk up to a scene and I could tell by just looking at the skid marks and just how, I could assess a skid mark and tell what happened and like who hit who. And if the lights, if someone was saying that the tail light didn't work, I didn't see the brake lights, they weren't working. I knew how to do the analysis to determine that, oh, no, actually, when this was broken, it was actually lit. So I knew who was lying to me, who
yeah,
wasn't, because of all this expertise. And it was actually, it was pretty exhilarating, really, to
okay.
have that level of expertise where you could handle it. And you handled it on your own.
Yeah,
You
that's
just,
amazing. So, what year, I should back up a little bit. What year did you get on LAPD, just for reference, point of reference?
93. So I
Okay.
did 3 years with the sheriffs prior to going over to the LAPD. So actually, like the Rodney King riots,
Yeah.
I was with the LA County sheriffs at that
Oh, you
time.
were with the sheriffs at the time. Did they deploy any jailers out for those riots?
Oh yeah, they sure did. I was actually out having dinner at a Tony Roma's in Glendale, which is a suburb of Los Angeles, just north of Los Angeles, with my roommate who was also a deputy sheriff,
Yeah.
and saw on the news that we saw the Reginald Denny incident unfolding, and then the news basically said, "Hey, all LAPD and all LA County sheriff's personnel report to your unit of assignment." So, this was
All
back,
hands on deck. Here we go.
you
Yep.
didn't, we didn't have pages or cell phones back there, and that's how
Right.
they got a hold of you. And if you weren't home to answer your phone, they got you through the news.
Yeah.
So I went home and packed up my stuff, and I went to work. And I didn't get home probably for 2 weeks. I was out working for 2 weeks. So I went to my assignment, and they had us get all of our riot gear. And I was bussed down to Firestone Station. And to give you a little bit of context, that it's Firestone Station is just to the east of 77th Division. They actually border
Okay.
one another. And that's where I went, and I worked the first few nights there, and then we ended up going down to North Long Beach, which was LA County Sheriff's area, which was popping off a bit. And then I spent the remainder of that 2 weeks that I said I had wasn't going home, working in custody, because there were over 16,000 arrests made during the riots, and on all of those arrestees had to be processed through the inmate reception center, which is where I worked my custody assignment.
Oh, okay.
We were extremely busy.
Now, on the street, like, what was that like for you? Like, what were you doing? What was your job?
It was just absolute chaos. It was anarchy. There wasn't even really any direction. I remember we bussed in on the LA County Sheriff buses,
Yeah.
which and we went down we didn't go through the center of town, which would be the 110 freeway, because that's everything was burning. That was just the
Sure.
hot zone. So we went around and went south on the 710 freeway, which is a Long Beach freeway, and we came in from the east. And as we got closer to Los Angeles, it was, you know, there were over 7,000 fires. I mean, 3,100
That's like something
businesses
out of a movie.
were just destroyed. 63 people were killed
Yeah.
during the riots, and I mean, it was absolute anarchy and chaos. And what was really kind of disturbing in a sense was we'd be on these buses, fully loaded with deputy sheriff personnel in riot gear, clearly marked buses, and these people were just looting these stores with big screen televisions and stereos and arms full of clothing. They didn't even flinch. I mean,
Wow.
they the utmost disrespect for authority that I was witnessing was something very unfamiliar to me, because
Sure.
I was still very green.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
growing up in the Midwest, you respected the police. You listened to
Yep.
the police. They asked you to
Right.
do something. You really didn't question them. You just did it. Um, so it was something very unfamiliar to me. And but it was telling me how badly the law enforcement community relations had eroded over time,
Mm.
and that it had gotten to this point, and that we had this kind of a flashpoint where everything just exploded, ignited. It was something to experience. It really was.
So, okay, we might get back to that later, but your career trajectory, you go to accident reconstruction or accident investigator, excuse me. Where did you go after that? How long were you there? Like, what was the trajectory of your career?
Well, I was there a relatively short period of time, and then I was selected to be a field training officer at Wilshire Division, which is in West Bureau, and it's just west of downtown. It's one of the most diverse divisions in the city of Los Angeles. It has one of the highest call loads. It's
Okay,
very busy. I
which is
wouldn't say
great for
it's
an
the most
FTO.
violent.
That's great for an FTO.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it wasn't the most violent division, but it was
Yeah.
the one of the busiest.
Okay.
Um, so I went there, and I served as a field training officer, and then I promoted to what's called a senior lead officer. There's the way we deploy in the LAPD is it's called a basic car plan. So you have geographic areas within the division that are basic car areas, and each one of those basic car area has a senior lead officer.
Oh,
Essentially, you're kind of like the chief of police, or the liaison between the department in the division you work and the community members within that basic car area. So I did that as a senior lead officer, and then from there. are promoted to Metropolitan Division, which is like our special forces. It's the SWAT and the K-9 and the
Yeah.
mounted units there as well. And I worked there in what was called A platoon, and which was a field platoon, and we would do high risk warrants, dignitary protection, mobile field force stuff for all the planned demonstrations. We do crime suppression details in areas where violent crime was spiking in the city, and that was basically our specialty. And that's where I served until I made sergeant, and I was sent to Rampart.
Wow, sent to Rampart. I mean, for those who don't know, you know, there was quite the thing going on at Rampart. A lot of stuff was exposed. Could you just kind of give us the 30,000 mile view that, what was going on there? And what was it like getting sent into that culture after all this stuff happened?
Okay, well, first I would say that, just like you asked me, no, did you want to go to traffic? No, I didn't. Did I
Yeah.
want to go to the part? No, I didn't. And and it's when you promote, you're allowed to give your wish list. You give three divisions that you would like to go to, and you get to go to one of those.
Wow.
And Rampart was not on my list, but I went to Rampart. And basically what had happened was I was identified by the commanding officer that had been placed in Rampart to clean things up, and he was putting together his leadership team to change the entire culture there. And I was identified as somebody he wanted there, so that's why I went there. And it
Okay.
turned out to be another one of those things that you didn't want to do, but it turned out to be one of the best things I ever did. And so basically, the scandal it dealt with the gang unit because Rafael Perez, who was assigned to the Rampart gang unit, he was involved in some of the most egregious corruption you could ever imagine. Now, back in 1997, there was a bank robbery that was committed by LA police officers.
Oh my
David
God.
Mack was was charged and convicted for it. He essentially had coordinated this where his girlfriend, who worked at the bank, had ordered $722,000 the day before to be delivered. And then there were he and two other unidentified individuals, and to this day they haven't been identified, robbed the place.
Wow.
And the weekend following, he went to Vegas. One of the people he went to Vegas with was Rafael Perez.
Okay.
So then you fast forward, and then they identify these pounds of cocaine that have been stolen out of evidence lockup, and they were able to trace it back to Rafael Perez,
Wow.
who was who was selling the cocaine on the street to
Oh
a
my God.
girlfriend
And
for
he's a police
personal.
officer.
A police officer working Rampart crash. Yeah.
Wow.
So they jam him up, and he ends up getting a deal where he starts talking, and he talks about all this corruption that's going on. Basically 70 officers get kind of caught up in this whole thing, this big corruption scandal.
Yeah.
And he's given, you know, free reign absent a charge of murder. So if he implicated himself in stuff, he wasn't going to be charged unless it was something like murder.
Yeah.
And so what was being uncovered was planning of evidence, unjustified shootings on duty, that's,
That's
perjuring
just
self during,
that's just crazy.
it was egregious stuff. So that's what was occurring when I was sent to Rampart.
How
And then
many, let me
ultimately,
ask you, how many cops were arrested and how many of them lost their jobs? Do you know?
I think there was totally 770, I think maybe 12 that perhaps lost their jobs. I think out of the 70, 53, I think, were sent to a border rights. Now, those numbers, I'm just kind of going off the top of my head. They may
Yeah.
be off here or there, but
Okay.
something like that. But, it was pretty egregious what was going on. And, and basically it happened because supervision allowed it to happen.
Oh
They,
yeah.
they weren't asking the questions that, there's all kinds of red flags that should have been going off. And it was a cultural thing. So that's what had to be changed. So ultimately, what they ended up doing was they disbanded the crash units because it became, an identity or known as, being corrupt. So they got rid of that. But the problem was you still had issues of gang crime that
Right.
needed to be.
Absolutely.
So the department's answer to that was creating a new entity that had a higher level of accountability. What they did was they established what was called the gang enforcement detail, as well as the narcotics enforcement detail, who worked for a lieutenant and answered directly to the captain of the division.
Hmm.
So I was selected to be the officer in charge of the gang unit, gang enforcement detail. And I was there to clean it up and change the entire culture and the paradigm and how we viewed gang crime and how we addressed gang crime. And I implemented a lot of different innovative measures. And now I'll tell you, it's my leadership style. These weren't my ideas. The key that I focused on was selecting the right personnel. And once you get the right people in place, you you become a transformative leader and you allow them to be innovative and creative in methods in which you're going to use to reduce gang crime. And it was my responsibility to facilitate that. And it was amazing some of the things that we were able to do. We actually were awarded the meritorious unit citation and became kind of the model to be exemplified citywide in regards to addressing gang crime.
What were some of the like highlights of that? Can you give us like an example of what you
Oh,
did differently?
historically, what the focus was numbers. How many felony arrests, how many, but and I'm like, felony arrests don't mean anything. I mean, you can sit out there and rip off these wannabe gang members or gang associates all day long for, narcotics and things like that, and have all kinds of impressive numbers, but you're actually not addressing the violent gang crime. And so what you needed to do is you need to be more surgical in the methods in which you used. So what I looked at was not crime or arrest rates, but what I looked at and I measured my officers through were their filing rates and conviction rates. And what I did is I bolstered the expertise of the officers that were assigned to the unit. Oddly, there was no requirement in the LAPD for officers working gangs to be court recognized experts in their gangs that they're assigned. And I changed that in Rampart. I said, within a year, you have got to become a court qualified expert in the gangs that you're assigned. That was a requirement. And then I maximized the schooling that they could go to because it's
Okay.
always been my belief, although, yes, it was a very violent division. I mean, Rampart's 7.9 square miles, and you're talking about 36,000 people per square mile.
Wow.
It's the most densely populated division in the city, and it's one of the most violent. That's where you're going to find, MS-13 and 18th Street and Maris Salvatrucha and all that. I mean, it's
Yeah.
very violent. It's very violent. So yes, we focused on tactical prowess. So these officers could perform well under rapidly unfolding tactical scenarios. But ultimately, what was most important was the tool that they had between their ears, that gray matter. Did they understand the law? Did they understand it to the point where they didn't have to hesitate to determine, well, can I do this? Can I not do that? They they were required actually in their arrest reports when they would take certain actions, they would have to cite the case law that gave them the authority to do that. That's something that I
Okay.
implemented. That's what I required. And I got to tell you, I mean, to be honest with you, that a lot of people didn't like me. It was a paradigm shift that many people were resistant to. But my people in the unit, they bought into it, and actually, it became a mantra of the unit. I mean, they can tell you right now, there's not one person that worked for me that can't tell you what Wardlow versus Illinois is, and all that. It's it's
Well,
it's just
eventually, if you are an active cop, you're making lots of arrests, you are going to be in court. So you're going to be testifying, especially motion hearings, motion to suppress hearings. And it's like, how did you get that gun? How did you get that dope? And if you're sharp and you have all your ducks in a row, you can make that defense attorney look like a dork. And it's not with, belittling them or yelling or theatrics. It's like what you said, case law or whatever, and it's like I could always tell somebody that went through a rough motions hearing by their reports because I was a sergeant for 17 years and I was the head of our district gang squad. And I could always tell because it's like, they'd start out, it's like, on date, date, and time, squad, whatever. And, it was 2 o'clock in the morning, but the street lights were illuminated, blah, blah, blah. I'm in my fully marked squad car, with the emergency lights activated, and I'm wearing a City of Milwaukee police uniform with my badge and nameplate affixed to its outermost garment. Just the verbiage that they use. It's like, oh yeah, these guys have been, because I've been through it. I've been grilled up there too. And like you said before, it's what between your ears, and if you can combine that with a go-getter cop who knows what they're doing, but here's the issue: when you go higher up the chain of command, a lot of them just don't care about the quality of their arrests. They want numbers. I've worked for people like that. And it's like, it's like, I want numbers. Yeah, but we just did X, Y, and Z. I don't care about that. I have to talk to the chief in the morning at the briefing. And it's like, yeah, I had this one really good arrest where we're chopping the head off the snake. We're doing all this great stuff. And it's like, okay, how many traffic tickets did you write? How many of this? How many of that? And they have such tunnel vision. And I mean, we could talk about ComStat later, but that's one of the downsides to it, is they don't see the quality that some of these cops are doing. And reversing back a little bit with the Rampart stuff, boy, I can just close my eyes and see what some of these bosses were like. You get wrapped up in it. You start believing the BS that you're spewing. And like you said before, the ends justify the means all of a sudden. And you have bosses that are like, yeah, don't worry about it. And unless you kill somebody, I can get you out of it. No, you can't. You're delusional. They all just the egos that get into this, and they want to be one of the guys, running on. You still have to be the boss. Somebody's got to be
Well,
there.
the one thing I always told the people that worked for me was that, I'm never going to cover anything up. We don't cover things up, but you're honest with me. And as long as your heart's in the right place,
Yep.
and you're not malicious in intent, we can fix anything. But don't ever lie to me, and don't ever be call us with your heart. Always have the proper motivations in mind. And they took that to heart. And actually it was reflective in the way they performed out in the field.
So you went from Rampart. Where'd you go after that?
Well, I did. What happened was, well, at Rampart, and it's probably worth talking about, is when I was there, um, we then went under because of the scandal and all of these things that had occurred with the LAPD in regards to being identified as you know having a deep systemic issues where there's um, failure in addressing excessive use of force incidents and violations of people's constitutional rights, and it was a systemic issue within the organization. There was a consent decree that was imposed on us in 2001,
That's tough.
and it took us 10 years to get out from under that.
Yep.
You have to get there's a lot of talk now about consent decrees and how it's just a money grab, and it's a business and that. But I got to tell you, I can assure you that the LAPD needed it.
Okay.
We needed an entire cultural overhaul, and really what a consent decree is I would describe it as a blueprint for management best practices, and it's all about reducing the liability, um, having best practices, and ultimately having the optimal outcomes in critical incidents. And so I became very familiar with the consent decree, because there was an entire chapter of the consent decree that was on the operation and management of gang units. And then another big section of it was force, the investigation and adjudication of force. So to answer your question, I went from the gang unit. I developed a pretty strong reputation within the organization with how I ran that unit. That Chief William Bratton was the chief at the time, and I was brought into a coveted position at Use of Force Review Division. And what my role there was that all officer-involved shootings and lethal force incidents are evaluated by Use of Force Review Division. And I wrote the chief's rationale that is submitted to the Honorable Board of Police Commissioners, who are the ultimate adjudicators of lethal force. I wrote his rationale in regards to what he believed the findings should be. So I did that for a number of years. until I made lieutenant.
Was that under the umbrella of internal affairs?
That is not. That is not. Um, so I did that for a number of years, and then when I made lieutenant, generally, and I was looking forward to going out to patrol, and Bratton didn't really care about the numbers. He believed in putting the right people in the right places, and he said, "Well, the way I look at it is, you can go out to patrol and learn how to run a watch, or you can continue to work for me and learn how to run a police department."
Hmm.
So I thought, okay, I guess I'm staying here. And so I did. And then I didn't go out to patrol until after Bratton left and Chief Charlie Beck took over. And then I was out for 1 year, and Chief Beck brought me back to do the same thing, but as a lieutenant, and do
Okay.
the same thing for him that I did for Bratton. And then ultimately I transitioned over to the investigative side. I became one of the lieutenants as an officer in charge of the detective entity that investigates all officer-involved shootings and lethal force incidents. And I did that for until the end of my career.
Well, let
So
me ask
I've
you,
had my hands in over 700 cases.
God. Well, let me ask you this. Does LAPD still investigate their own lethal force? Like, say
They
an
do.
officer shoots and kills somebody, they investigate their own.
They do. The only
Interesting.
exception now is if they have, like what they call a perception shooting. Like if the officer believes that the suspect had a firearm and there's no firearm recovered,
Okay.
then there's an outside entity, because
Interesting.
that just kind of raises the level of scrutiny.
Yes, because we changed. I was the incident commander for 7 officer involved shootings where an officer had to shoot and kill somebody. And the last 2, I was a block away when it happened. And when I was doing those, we investigated our own. We started out, we had a shoot team. It was mostly homicide detectives and, lieutenants, captain, et cetera, et cetera. They would come out and do the investigation along with the district attorney. He would show up, of course, and they had their own investigators, and that would be it. Then there was a law that was passed that we could not investigate our own anymore. And it's like, okay, we would assist, because you would have a shoot team from the suburbs. It would be a combination of, say, like 2 or 3 suburbs. It's like, and it was like on an on call basis. So, okay, this month, yeah, okay, Greenfield, Greendale, and Wauwatosa, guess what? You're up. If Milwaukee has to shoot and kill somebody, and it was reciprocal, we would do the same for them. But the overwhelming majority were in the city of Milwaukee. And I had to deal with the outside shoot team for the first time, with I think my second to last one. And I'm thinking to myself, you know what? I understand. I don't agree with it, but I understand the rationale behind that law. But I have these guys from the suburbs who, yesterday were investigating, they have a bank robbery here or there, or they also have garage burglaries, they have whatever. Now they're investigating the most important homicide that there is, I think. And that made me very, very nervous because the Milwaukee guys, that was their bread and butter. They investigated homicides every day. At the height, of the crack wars, what, we were up to like 250, 270 homicides for a city of 600,000, over 1,000 non-fatal shootings a year. You know, it's what we did. It became mechanical almost. And now all of a sudden you have these people that really don't investigate that stuff, and your future is in their hands. And that's very unnerving, for the cop and for the supervisors on scene. You're like, whew, I hope this goes well. But I mean, I had to testify at a coroner's inquest back when that was my first officer involved shooting where somebody was killed. And the officer, it took the DA a year to figure it out, but they charged him with homicide. And the officer, took his own life. But that was the worst scene I ever rolled up on. It was like, I really wish I would have hit a tree on my way to this. I just, it was bad. It was bad. And I'm like, wow, any more surprises you got for me guys? Because it was literally out of it like a movie or something. It's like, oh, by the way, Sarge. Oh, by the way, Sarge. I'm like, anything else? Come on, guys. Throw me a bone here. And then, the shoot team's coming and I'm giving the briefing and everyone's jaws are dropping at the same time. And I'm like, yeah, this ain't
Well,
good.
part of the reality is that the community has to have confidence that the investigations are unbiased and objective.
Correct.
And the one thing I would say that Los Angeles has done fairly well is we have office of the Inspector General. So anytime that there's an officer involved shooting, there's a representative from the Inspector General's office, who all of them I had strong relationship with. And ultimately, what they end up doing is they complete a report of recommended findings that parallels that of the chiefs, that both go to the Honorable Board of Police Commissioners when they're contemplating how they're going to ultimately adjudicate the case. So we don't always see eye to eye on stuff, and sometimes the recommendations may be different,
Yeah.
but you're working with this a civilian entity, an oversight entity that at times may see things differently. And I got to tell you, some of the, a lot of my eyes were at times were opened up in things that they brought to my attention. I didn't think of that, or I didn't think of that. So, I had a really good, strong relationship working with them. And I think that helped with it, as well as the more serious ones where you'd have officer involved shootings where you'd have misses. I
Mm.
mean, only I think 70% of the rounds fired in officer involved shootings don't hit their target.
Not in
Um,
Milwaukee, just so you
so,
know. We
yeah.
hit what we're shooting at.
So the reality is oftentimes you have officer involved shootings and no one is actually struck. But when you have someone struck, then you have a representative from the district attorney's office that's out there. Because ultimately what our job is, it's bifurcated job that we're doing in our investigation. Where one, yes, we're investigating it to have the investigation to adjudicate the circumstances of that case, the tactics that were used, the decision to draw your weapon, as well as the application of force, whatever that may be. And and then the other side of what we're doing is we're looking into the potential criminal culpability of the officer's actions. And so you have to work with the district attorney's office on that. So, there is some level of outside oversight and accountability to these other entities that are involved in the process out in Los Angeles.
Yeah, that's interesting because like where I worked, it's a little bit different. We have a fire and police commission that has no cops or firefighters on. It's all civilian. And we call it the kangaroo court because it was completely politically motivated and it was some of the decisions that they came up with, we're just wondering if they just rolled some dice in the back room or something. I mean, it was horrible. It was beyond horrible. And going back to we had what was called the Collins Agreement. It was a voluntary, what were we just talking about? The 10-year that the LAPD just had, where you're under the microscope. What is that called?
For the consent decree?
Yeah, the consent, excuse me. Yeah. Yeah, we did a voluntary one. And unfortunately, what that bred was all these cops, sergeants, lieutenants who never did a lick of police work in their lives. They hid their entire careers. And when this came up, oh, they were so excited because they could get a job judging other cops, going through their body cameras. They're going through their uses of force, and they never got any use of force as a cop. They never did the job. Yeah, they went through field training, whatever, but you had the inside cats that were cowards. And I mean, I'll just call it the way it is. And they'd fast track up to IED, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, cool, I get to fry some cops. This is great. They're just drooling at it, and I'm like, it was so disgusting. We knew the ones that were doing it too, and you know what? And transversely, we had some guys up at IED that were, wow, you made it up there. You spent a lot of time up there as a cop or a sergeant or whatever, and it's like, but they were very straight shooters, and it's like, okay, I have no problem with you being up there because you've done the job. You've been in jams. You were an active cop that actually put handcuffs on people and had to fight with people and got shot at and all of that stuff. So that's where I see some of that can go sideways. It attracts a certain there's people who have good hearts and want to do the right thing, period. And then there's some that just see it as an easy out and it's like, okay, I can put my 48 or 50 hours in a week. And you know what? This is great. I'll just keep doing this. I mean, did you run into much of that or not?
Well, I think every organization has a certain segment of its sworn personnel that may meet that description you just
Yeah.
gave. What I found more troubling was, um, when you had instances where the department itself would take a position that was politically expedient. Where an officer may have done nothing wrong, and yes, it may not look pretty, and there may be some community uproar,
Right.
but the department, rather than doing the right thing and commanding the narrative and explaining why they're going to stand by the officer, they fold and they throw an officer under the bus. I did see that, and I found that even more troubling because, the reality is with at least the LAPD, you could have someone assigned to internal affairs that's conducting an investigation of someone that, say, works for me. Well, I get that investigation, I get to review it, and I write the letter of intent, which is basically my recommendation on the adjudication of that case.
Right.
So I'm a stop plug. If this investigation is deficient or it's biased or what have you, I can direct that additional investigation occur, and to ensure that the product that I am reviewing and determining whether I'm going to sustain a complaint or find somebody, exonerate them, or you know that that has to be a full, complete, accurate investigation. And so we have this checks and balances along the way to prevent that. But yes, of course, I experienced circumstances where there were, they're kind of like, well, we know how this is going to end up, and they just they either don't have the investigative insight and wherewithal to have a thorough, accurate, and complete report, or perhaps they maliciously are trying to create an outcome that is not necessarily justified. But I can't say for sure what their motivations were, but I did see that.
Yeah. And
But I think
and
the
what people
system.
don't realize is, it's all optics, because, again, I had 7 of those. And I think every one of them, I'd be calling into the shift commander, this is what I've got, so they can start making notifications. And one of the first questions is always, it's like, who is the officer? And you're going to know your officer. Okay. Yeah, it's Sergeant O'Donnell. Okay. He's a white guy. Who'd he shoot? Were they black? Yeah. And it's like, what does this have to do with anything right now? This is, it's like, okay, I'm glad you asked if my officer's okay. No, you didn't. Because I know when they go up the chain, they're going to be asked the same questions. Not what were the circumstances, not, is the officer or anybody, was anybody else injured or killed? What they're laser focused on that. Not everybody, not everyone, but
Well, it was my experience, and I would say this, that yes, when I would get a phone call of an officer involved shooting that just occurred, I would get a quick briefing
yep.
on what happened. And I had to make sure that I had the information that I knew the next phone call that I was going to be making was to the chief level person. I needed to make sure I had the answers for them.
Oh,
And you're
yes.
right. It oftentimes I was asked, what's the race of the officer? What's the race of the suspect? And it wasn't because I felt that they were making something out of race that shouldn't be addressed. They actually were in tune with the community police relationships and needed to know these things so they could start putting into place the processes that were going to help quell the the community criticism, perhaps, of the situation, because they were very well aware of who the problem makers may be in certain communities. So, it's about controlling the narrative. It's about reaching out to the the clergy, the religious leaders in the community, the people in the schools and in the business leaders to help understand, and so to make sure that the community understands what actually occurred, and you don't allow rumor and innuendo to run rampant to where you unfortunately have even a further deterioration of the relationship between the police and the communities you serve. So they actually were asking that question. People would be upset about it, but I understood why they were doing it, because from that, the answer to that question, it could spurn the use of other situations and tactics you would use to keep a lid on things for the betterment for not only the police department, but for the community that you're serving. So I kind of get it. I don't really throw them under the bus for that. I think you have to know that when you're in a city like Los Angeles.
Yeah, see, I see your point, but I also see they would be running scared, and they were scared to tell, the boss what actually happened, et cetera. And it's like, these are the facts. Let's roll with it. The whenever you try, and not just Oscar involved, whenever you try to cover something else, whenever you lie, it always comes to bite you in the ass. But I saw it happen time and time again, and I'm talking like upper echelon, and I'm just like, that's just stupid. Don't do it. Just these are the facts. This is what happened. And we don't know yet because we're what, a half an hour into this investigation. We're not going to have all the answers for you. And I understand what you're saying, but not to get political, but what happened in Kenosha, with the Kyle Rittenhouse shooting and all that, and then there was the shooting where the copper shot it was a white cop. He shot a black guy, like I think 4 or 5 times in the back, as he was going for a knife, but the investigation wasn't even close to being complete. And the governor and the lieutenant governor of our state went on record and say, well, this is obviously because of systemic racism within the Kenosha Police Department, but their investigation isn't complete yet. Well, anybody reading that newspaper article or hearing those speeches, all they hear is systemic racism, white guy shooting black guy 5 times in the back. And
Right.
he was cleared. He did nothing wrong. He was within policy and he was within the law, but the city burned down. Because of those stupid ass comments that he was making. But that's
But
politics.
one thing, and that I have always felt that is really incumbent upon law enforcement agencies is that they have a strong hold of the narratives. And the problem is that many police executives don't have the training, the expertise, or even by inclination are in tune with how to manage the media. And oftentimes it involves having the relationships long before the critical incident even happens. So, like in Los Angeles, we had the PIO, the Public
Mm-hmm.
Information
Yep.
Officer,
Yep.
and they would have these relationships with all the various media, um, anchors and stuff, the people that would come out and interview you out at scene, to include myself. I had the relationships with them. So you know, so you would give them what you knew you could give them, and they trusted that when you knew more, you would give it to them based on the fact that you had this relationship. So that they wouldn't go try to get information from someone that perhaps may have witnessed something or what have you, which could then spiral out of control and actually not be accurate whatsoever.
Right.
So it's really about being in tune and taking control of that narrative, which takes place long before the incident even actually happens. It's all about the relationships that you foster, and you need to understand the media. And then Chief Bratton was brilliant. I mean, this guy's masterful. Historically, the LAPD, you would have someone that went through the academy and they rose up through the ranks and they made captain, and you assigned them to be the commanding officer of media relations. What expertise do they have? They don't have any. So he was brilliant. He brought in Mary Grady, who had decades of media experience in Los Angeles, had won a number of golden mics and all these awards, and
Yeah.
brought her in and used her as his guide. She would basically guide and direct him on, okay, this is if we release this information, this is what we can expect. If we withhold this information, this is what we can expect. So he was able to make, really sound judgments. And he did his due diligence in determining how best to manage incidents. And a lot of stuff happened when he was our chief that he was able to keep a lid on because of how masterfully he managed the media. And
Well,
oftentimes I see, we don't have to look too far back. Look at New Orleans on New Year's Day.
yeah.
What a debacle. The management of the media
Oh,
there,
it-
awful.
yeah.
I mean,
You're
and,
absolutely
and
right.
it and it caused, rumor and innuendo to run rampant, and I mean, just complete misinformation, and it was a shame. And it's those sorts of things that law enforcement needs to improve upon in order to basically protect itself from undue criticism.
Yeah. I think it starts at the top. The quality of your chief or sheriff or superintendent or whatever you call them, whoever that person is at the very top, they set the culture. They set the expectations. And, what you were saying about, with the press, same thing. They're going to develop those relationships and put the right people in the right spots, not because they're buddies and they bowl together every Tuesday night, or, what, yeah, I was friends with your dad, coming up. So, I'll make you the PI. No, have the right person for the right job. And again, that all starts at the very top. And, sometimes you might get some heat for doing the right thing, but please, please, please do the right thing. Don't throw your cop under the bus just to avoid an uncomfortable situation or whatever the case may be. Please do the right thing. There's right and wrong. I'm a huge believer in that. And yeah, just don't do that. So let's
Right.
go forward. What is your opinion of the LAPD now compared to like when you were there? When did you retire? What year?
January of last year.
Very recently. Okay. So has it changed much, do you think, or not?
Well, I would say Chief Jim McDonnell, who was selected by Mayor Bass to be the next chief of police. He's in place, and I worked directly for him at a period of time in my career, and I have the utmost respect for him, and I believe he was absolutely the right choice. That's not to take away from Chief Ted Garides or Bob Arcos, who were the other two finalists. They're both highly qualified. But
Okay.
that being said, Jim McDonnell just brings that next level of expertise. He had served as an assistant chief at the LAPD and left and was the chief of Long Beach PD and then ultimately the sheriff of LA County. And he is the full meal deal, as
Okay.
I would say. He
Excellent.
he's going to take them to the next level. So I'm very hopeful and pleased in everything that I'm seeing. He's doing an outstanding job.
Good, good. Now, appearances are important. And when I think of LAPD, I think they have some of the sharpest uniforms, and their officers, I think, looked, and maybe it's because of television and movies, there's a lot, going on as far as that goes when it comes to LAPD. But I always thought it was pretty iconic. But I thought with the advent of vest carriers, beards, tattoos, it made me sick. All of a sudden, this super sharp looking cops, they're looking like thugs, I think. I just I just don't like it. It's like there's that certain sharpness to what the community expects and deserves from a police officer. What are your feelings on that?
I don't know if this is a generational thing or what have you, but I agree with you. I believe that officers should be cleanly shaven.
Yes.
Of course, you have a mustache, but you absolutely should be cleanly shaven. The exterior vest, ballistic vest, it's ridiculous. I'm a firm believer, and I 100%, endorse the concealable body armor. I mean, this
Yep.
day and age, you
So
can
do I.
have a high-rated vest that you can't even tell you have one on. They're so thin. Um, but they can stop just about everything, really, and at the end of the day, it is about perceptions. And unfortunately, I live in a small community of 4,100 people, and these officers run around like they're in Iraq.
I
And
know.
I'm like, you know, I just there's nothing that they're going to be getting involved in that they wouldn't have time to deploy their external jacket, ballistic jacket in the event that they needed to. But it's just a militarization of law enforcement. Back in 1989, um, the uh, the Congress they passed the thing allowing the Pentagon to give excess military equipment to law enforcement agencies and sheriff's departments. And since I think they started giving the equipment out and stuff, you could start accessing it back in, I believe it was like 96.
Okay.
And they since then there's been like $7 billion of military equipment that law enforcement agencies have gotten. It's averaging about 390 million a year. About 10,000 agencies have gotten this stuff, but it is there. It's a militarization. I talked to a lot of people that I got on the job with, and we got on the job back when we were, you were guardians. Now that didn't mean that you were pushovers. You were
Right.
competent and had the ability to, handle yourself in a rapidly unfolding tactical scenario. But on the forefront of things wasn't this militaristic, like, aura about the officers. And I agree with you. You and I are cut from the same cloth when we
Yeah, I
talk.
mean, they're not Navy SEALs. You mean, I understand, you know, I guess I'm all for equipping, having the proper equipment for the officers. So if, things do go sideways and, things are getting bad, they have the tools and equipment to defend themselves, defend the community. There was a huge hullabaloo when we got patrol rifles. And it was like, oh God, you don't need, yes, we do need these, for these reasons. And if you have a good range master that can articulate why you need these things, I mean, it's a no-brainer. But that doesn't mean you're deploying a patrol rifle to every, assignment that you're going to. And if you are, there's something wrong with you. You shouldn't be doing that. So but like the military thing, I have to chuckle because we would get military stuff. It's like I remember we got just a glut of gas masks that were all outdated and were useless. But somebody in the department, oh yeah, we'll take it. But then my guys that were in the military, they're like, Sarge, these won't work. Then we're like, great. Then we got biochem like suits, and they're like, Sarge, you need an air bottle with this. If we put these on, we'll suffocate. But at the very top, it's like, oh yeah, let's get this stuff. Let's get this stuff. Let's get it. It's like, be careful what if you want to go shopping with the military, and it's not always the best stuff. People say, oh yeah, military grade, blah blah blah. That's usually bargain basement crap. So just be careful with that. But yeah, I just think there should be an appearance, especially if you're in a uniform. A part of the uniform is you, like clean shaven, mustache, fine, as long as that's trimmed or whatever. Full sleeve tattoos, you look like a goof. I think. I mean, this is my kids got full sleeves, yeah, and it's like I think it is generational, etc. But I just think it looks horrible, especially hand tattoos, face tattoos, neck tattoos. It's like come on, we can do better than this. But again, generational, and most departments don't know how to grapple with it. We had a tattoo committee. Come on, tattoo committee. That was laughable. Oh, that tattoo's okay, but no, that too. Yeah, no, you shouldn't have that one. Really? So now you're the tattoo king or queen. It's like this is ridiculous. And again, the my big gripe with the outer vest carriers was they didn't take care of them. It's like we have dark blue uniforms. Well, you're out in the sun a lot. Guess what? Now it's light blue and you look like a goof. It's like, go wash that thing. That thing is disgusting. They'd wear the same one every day and they wouldn't wash them and they're getting frayed. Then you got the coppers that don't take care of themselves. They gain some weight. Now it looks like a sports bra that they're parading around and it's ridiculous. Yeah. I spent 25 years wearing the inner vest. I wore it every time I was on the street. I survived. I did just fine. And those were the old ones that felt, I mean, you know what that's like. They feel
Right.
like cardboard when you're like moving around like this. But yeah, you break it in. But anyways, hey, let's talk about OJ. Guilty or not?
With the insight that I have at being an investigator of officer involved shooting scenes and stuff, the reality is for the conspiracy theorists to be correct, there's a heck of a lot of people that would have had to have been in on it to actually for it to have occurred. So, generally speaking, the more people that would have to be in on it in order for the conspiracy theory to have any validity whatsoever, the less likely that it's actually the case. So, yeah, he was absolutely guilty.
Yeah, I would 100% in my mind at least. Yeah, but the O.J. Simpson trial did change LAPD. It did change a lot of stuff. It wasn't so much O.J. was on trial, LAPD was on trial. It kind of shifted. Were there some like significant changes that came out of that circus? I mean trial?
Well, really, it wasn't just the LAPD in regards to that investigation. You can't look at it just in a vacuum in that regard. It really had to do with the decades of the deterioration of the relationship that the LAPD had with the communities they serve. And What I mean by that is what set up OJ was the trial of the four officers involved in the Rodney King beating.
Yeah.
I mean, they were found not guilty. I think one of them they weren't able to come to um, come to a ruling in regards to an excessive use of force on one of them. But the fact that they weren't held accountable to what I would say, I got to be honest, when I look at that, that was excessive force. I mean, it's hard to reconcile otherwise. Do I want to see officers that, have to serve jail time, prison time, or anything? Absolutely not. But you know, the sense that the community had was that, they're not listened to. Um, they're not respected, and no one's ever held accountable, that everything's tilted against them. And so really what OJ was getting back,
Okay.
in my mind.
I mean, I call this circus, it's tongue in cheek, but it became a circus. And Judge Ito should never have let that go for a year. Could you imagine being a juror? Oh my God. For a year, that's your full-time freaking job. I mean, I can't imagine the hardship that would, do. And it went on too long. It just became a circus.
There was a lot of theatrics. I mean, a lot of
Oh yeah.
theatrics on the defense. There was a lot of missteps in the prosecution. Um, it was the perfect storm for, a bad outcome.
Yeah, it really was. Clark wants to say hi again. All right. All right. Now, let's see here. You know, you were, I'll go through, we already went through Rodney King. I don't think we need to talk about that. Uh, why did you retire? How many years did you put in? 33?
I did 33, yes.
Okay. Why?
Um, the reality was I was still young when I retired, and you know, I'm not unlike many people that have some challenges in their personal life, and challenges I had resulted in me having sole physical and legal custody of my son,
Okay.
starting back 10 years ago, and when he was 4 years old, and the challenge of me continuing with my career with the aspirations that I had which were to promote as high as I possibly could.
Yeah.
It was contrary to what my responsibility and role as a father was. And I got to the point where I was fortunate enough that I had done quite well financially, and I didn't need to continue to stay on the job. And I thought it was more important for me to be the father that my son needed me to be. So that's why I made the decision to retire, and not only retire, but return to my home state and raise him in an environment that was more consistent with place that I was raised. And I felt that he would, flourish and do much better. And I felt that that was my responsibility as his father. And so I decided to forego any aspirations I had in the department to continue to promote.
Well, my hat's off to you because you made the right choice. And there's plenty of coppers out there that don't make the right choice, between family and their jobs. And yeah, it's like it's cool to be on that one unit or keep working because then you got that promotion. But if your kids are estranged from you, you're on your fifth divorce, maybe it's time to look in the mirror and say, okay, what's more important? So my
Right.
hat's off to you. That's bravo. That's awesome. Now, how difficult was it for you to retire, or was it?
I mean, it really wasn't. When the job I had was really, really demanding. I had to work a lot of overtime when I was on call. So, I'd put in my day's work, and then I'd get home and I'd get called out to an officer involved shooting, be
Oh
out
yeah.
there all night to go back into the office. And I'd be at the movies with my son on a weekend, and I'd
Oh, that'd
get
be tough.
get called, and hey son, we got to go. And I
Yeah.
really got tired of hearing him say, Dad, we got to spend more father-son time together. And that's
Oh,
verbatim what he would tell me. That
that's
broke my
tough.
heart.
Yeah,
And
that's tough.
when you're rolling out to a call out and you got a tear in your eye,
Yeah.
um, because your son's crying, it's
Uh,
time to make a change. That's a time for a gut check, you
yeah,
know.
absolutely. Well, again, congratulations. That's the right thing. So good on you. Now you're the founder and CEO. Let's talk post-retirement. You're the founder and CEO of Law Enforcement Consultants. What is this, and why do it?
Law enforcement consultants is, you know, I've used my expertise in the use of force, primarily lethal force. So I provide expert testimony in civil and criminal cases, and I have a number of retired law enforcement personnel that actually work for me and do the same. But most importantly, we consult law enforcement agencies, and it's about implementing, making sure that they're implementing the management best practices, they're reducing liability, um, so they can enhance their efficiency and maximize the potential that they're going to have optimal outcomes in these critical incidents that are so significant in how the communities they serve view the law enforcement organization. And like I said, the consent decree working in critical assignments during the 10-year period that LAPD was under a consent decree gave me an unbelievable amount of insight into this. And unfortunately, law enforcement in this country at times can be quite insular, and people don't learn from the mistakes of other agencies. The mistakes that we made 2 decades ago that required us to be under consent decree are mistakes that many agencies are still making. And I'm trying to close that gap. I want to see law enforcement be successful moving forward. I want law enforcement to take it to the next level as we move forward in the 21st century.
Interesting. Now, your upcoming book, On Thin Ice, an LAPD veteran's journey to reimagine policing, is due out soon. When is that coming out?
We don't have a specific date yet, but
Okay.
I'm go I'm projecting that it'll be in June. But listen, my marketing people, I do what they tell me to do, so they'll make that
Okay,
determination.
gotcha. Is the book written, or are we in edits, or where are we with it?
We're just finishing up the edits. It'll be going to the formatter here, probably
Perfect.
t
That's great. Good for
actually
you.
right.
Yep, I see that.
It's
Outstanding. That's a great cover, by the way.
I wish I could say I designed it. I didn't.
Oh, my covers would look like, like stick people if I if I did. You wouldn't want a cover designed by me. So that's when you delegate to the people who do it really well. So yeah, outstanding. So why did you write the book?
Listen, I did my 33 years in law enforcement, and one of the frustrations that I had was that law enforcement tends to be like a ship at sea. It takes forever to turn. And there's a lot of areas that I don't think are, they're pretty obvious to people that there's areas for improvement in law enforcement. And the insight that I have, I thought it was really important to to give back to a profession that I love dearly. I bleed blue, and the book, it basically gives my personal background and my professional experiences, and I give some of my insights in regards to what actual solutions we can put into place to make these improvements to ensure that law enforcement is successful moving forward in the 21st century. And that's what the book will give the reader. It's something that whether you're a suburban housewife or you're in law enforcement yourself or you're a legislator, you'll find the book interesting.
Interesting. Very good. Now, I think to myself, it's like as far as reimagining police, I've went through I think 5 or 6 chiefs, in my 25 years on the job, and every one of them comes in with their like manifesto. They come in with their mission statement. And I always get a kick out of it because the more time you got on the job, you're like, yeah, you're not going to be here long. They'll do their 4 years or whatever. And the mayor falls in love with them. It's just a love fest. Oh, this guy or gal is the best. And almost all their careers are there's the rail, there's the door. You're run out on a rail. See ya. They fall out of love. There's egos involved. There's politics, and more than less, you have chiefs that are more than happy to not take any of the responsibility or blame for any of the deficiencies. It's always that, oh, darn those sergeants or darn that lieutenant or darn, and they just won't look in the mirror because they know they're not going to have a job then. And I don't know, it just got the only time I saw a, a mission statement that actually kind of worked was broken windows. It was we had a chief that's like, you know what, we're implementing broken windows. It was the only mission statement I saw where it's like, if somebody's being a criminal, we're going to lock them up. We're going to write tickets. We're going to lock them up. Now, in 2025, that would, I think it would have to be modified. But I like the spirit of, okay, we have a plan instead of vague generalities. And it's like, okay, community, based, policing. And I'm like, okay, that sounds great. How are you going to implement it? And when you'd actually ask those like tough questions, they didn't have answers. We're going to work together with our community partners. Okay, there's nowhere in any of your mission statement about putting people in jail, having good detectives put good cases on people who are habitual or, commit some heinous, heinous crimes. None of that is in there. So I don't know. I read the part that you gave me, and I'm hopeful. It looks good. So do you have an answer to this? Do you have an answer to, what's wrong with policing right now and how to fix it?
Well, it's we don't have enough time to go into all of that in detail.
Okay.
But the reality is I'm not about some of the stuff that you've been saying, like renaming things.
Yeah.
Just because you put lipstick on something doesn't change what it is.
Oh yeah.
The reality is it's like we can rename things time and time again. It's what has been done and it has actually been failing for how many decades now.
Right.
So, the real reality is it's looking at the empirical evidence and what suggests will actually make a difference. And moving forward and being guided by things like that. I think education is huge. And I'm not saying that every police officer has to have a master's degree in order to be hired. That's not what I'm saying. But, I spoke earlier about how insular law enforcement is. And unfortunately, in the United States, we are quite insular. We don't look at what is working elsewhere in this world. You look at the Nordic countries and how they go about policing their communities, beginning with not necessarily who they select to be their police officers, but how they select their police
Hmm.
officers begins there. What do we do here in the United States? It's a deselection process. As long as you
Oh
haven't been
yeah.
arrested and been charged with something, arrested and convicted, or you have X number of tickets and your financial situation is in order and stuff, you got a decent chance of getting hired. But really, what should we be doing? We should be identifying the characteristics that we know are indicative of somebody that's more likely than not to be successful in law enforcement. You want somebody that has empathy, you want somebody that has critical thinking skills, moral reasoning, self-awareness, all those sorts of things. Those are all characteristics. And these other countries, they spend the time necessary in the training to evaluate the people and then select the ones that they can determine will be successful as law enforcement officers. Here in the United States, it's wildly short, our training. I mean, the vast majority of training is like, 800 hours, 840 hours of academy time compared to the Nordic countries. They require like equivalent of a 4-year degree.
But
It's like
I
3 years,
I agree
years.
with you, but again, different chiefs that I've had, a lot of, like knee-jerk reactions to issues that we had are, oh, okay, we're going to give you this training. And the quality wasn't great. The academy, when I went through it, it was 6 months. It easily could have been 4 months. I mean, it was one guest speaker after another that was just garbage. You're just sitting there going, how did they even let them in here?
Well,
There's a
I,
difference between quality and quantity.
yeah, but it involves, you need to be able to have a more global perspective on these complex sociological issues that are confronting law enforcement, in today's environment. And, if you don't have a grasp of that, then you're going to be spinning your wheels. And it requires that you have some basic understanding of these types of things. And you don't get that here in the United States in your training. You just don't. And the other thing is that I would say is that it's important that we're not so insular where we're not afraid of creative encounters. We need to invite people to the table that have differing opinions, even and most importantly, those that are opposed to what our opinion may be. Because I've always said it's not about being right; it's about getting it right. And law enforcement needs to stop imposing its authority on people and start listening. Listen to what people say. My dad used to always tell me, he said, listen carefully, you know, ask thoughtfully and speak deliberately. And our law enforcement leadership is lacking some of that. in today's time, where we're not coming up with the solutions that are probably the best solutions to have optimal outcomes.
Yeah, I agree, and I always gave the same speech to the rookies that were coming out of the academy when they're coming to the district stations. And like one of the first things I would say is like, hold on to your friends that are not cops. Hold on to them for dear life, because it's real easy to get into that bubble and you're all thinking the same, you're all doing the same stuff. And I said, there's a whole big world out there, and you need to stay in that big old world because I think personally 21 is too young to be a cop
Mhm.
because you just haven't had the life experiences yet. I was 30 when I got on, and I was very happy that I wasn't happy at the time, but looking back, it gave me a lot of insight. I worked a lot of Joe jobs. I have my 4 year degree in sociology, and that qualified me to be the manager at IHOP, working 24 hours at a restaurant, selling cars, bartending. But I learned how to talk to people. And that's a skill that is some people are natural, some people you have to work on it. And I think, going back to being a jailer, shit, be a jailer for a year or two. You're going to learn how to talk to people, and you're going to learn, there's a big old world out there. But today, more than anything, and it's not just police work, it's everything. It's like everybody's in one camp or the other, and they don't want to listen to anybody unless they're in your camp. And I think that's a disservice. And like you said, I think that's important for the police to have that and have that mindset as well. There's a big old world out there, kids. So yeah, absolutely. I like that. So, what do you miss the most about, or the least about, not being a cop anymore?
Yeah, I think, you were in law enforcement. It's just the banter, the camaraderie.
There's
So
nothing else like it.
nothing like it. And it's that simple. I'll forever miss that.
Yeah,
Forever will.
the brotherhood and sisterhood of being a cop. I don't, maybe firefighters, military in a different way. I think there's nothing else like it. It just, and you know what? We had a front row to the greatest show on earth. We really did, and
Yeah.
that's why people write books and make movies about it. And we did it, And so that's the cool part, without a doubt. All right, I have a couple of Facebook questions real quick for you. I have the Cops and Writers Facebook group. Yeah, let's see here. That wanted. Here we go. First question come from Rachel Fried. What annoys you the most about how the media portrays law enforcement? What was something ridiculous that happened whilst on shift?
Well, unfortunately, excuse me, the media oftentimes has an agenda, and salacious stories sell newspapers,
Yep.
sell air, all of that sort of thing. And I mean, a perfect example, and we spoke about it earlier in the podcast, was like in New Orleans. Look how the media ran with these stories about with the information that was being disclosed without first corroborating it and making sure that it was accurate. And it just it makes things much more difficult for the law enforcement agency. Even though you can be critical of the law enforcement agency, the fact that they're the ones that put the information out, but that doesn't absolve the media from doing their due diligence to corroborate what they're putting out. They always said what is it, Mark Twain said that a lie can make it halfway around the world while the truth is still putting its shoes on, and
Yeah, I like that. I never heard that before. That's awesome.
that couldn't be more true in
Yes.
today's social media world. So, and then the second part of that was what was the craziest thing I'd ever.
Yeah, something ridiculous that happened whilst on shift.
Oh, good Lord. I mean, where do you start? I
I
mean, I
know
did
there's
33 years. This is the one thing I would say is that there's not a crime or a mischievous thing that a law enforcement officer has not done on duty.
okay.
That's what I would say.
That's
And
fair.
when you're exposed to that and you see something like that occur, it's ridiculous and it blows your mind. You would bet your life that that could never happen, but it actually did. So that's where I've always said that, oftentimes when these ridiculous complaints would come across your desk, you have to take them seriously because just because it sounds ridiculous, I got to tell you, everything that you could ever imagine, I've seen actually occur.
Yes,
So,
I agree with you there. That no doubt. Oh boy, Persha fragilistic. What's the hardest crime scene you had to face and why?
very early on in my career, I was working 77th Division, and I was involved as a secondary unit in a vehicle pursuit. And the suspect was going southbound on Figueroa and ran the red light at Martin Luther King Boulevard and hit a van that was full of a Hispanic family.
Yeah,
And the suspect shook it off, got out of the car, took off running.
of
Well, there
course.
were two children that were ejected and were killed.
Oh,
I remember standing there, seeing, hearing the mother screaming and seeing the
oh,
dead children laying there against the curb
oh,
and sitting there thinking, for what? This was a property crime, this was a
oh,
stolen vehicle. It wasn't taken at gunpoint. It wasn't, and that really changed the paradigm in which I looked at my authority as a law enforcement officer. And that, sometimes just because you're following policy and procedure, and this because it's legal for you to do, you still have to use judgments and determine whether it's the safest thing you should be doing, and or is there a better way? Is there another time that you can potentially apprehend this person and stuff? Because you're not only protecting yourself and potentially the people that are in that vehicle, but everybody you're passing is a potential victim of what can occur in a vehicle pursuit. So that change just really that broke my heart.
oh,
And
absolutely. Oh God. Then Cleveland St. James asks, was Willie Williams a good police chief?
he was a police chief when I was very early on in my
Okay,
career. And, he was kind of like a transitional police chief. It was good to have somebody from the outside at that time
okay.
in the history of the department. He was very big into community policing. We had, the Sarah model and, community police problem solving and that sort of thing. So his direction that he was taking the department was one that was, I think, important at the time to help try to bolster the relationship between the law enforcement agency and the communities we serve. But I can't say I have a bad thing to say about him. No.
All right. So let's wrap this up. What's next for you?
I'm my book will be coming out most likely in June. And it's about continuing to build my influence as a result of the experience and the expertise that I have, where I can, effectively assist law enforcement moving forward in any way, shape, or form. I'm building a lot of partnerships with various companies, and then one I'll tell you about is Compliant Technologies. They're the company that has come out with the glove. I don't know if you've heard of that,
No.
but it's a non-lethal tool that law enforcement can use. It's been used over 60,000 times, and it hasn't resulted in one injury. And what it is, it's a glove that you can put on. You can put them on both hands, and you can fire your weapon. You can tie your shoes. You can do anything that you normally would do with the regular hands. But they have these pads in the palm that you can press a button and they become electrically charged. And they're different than a taser. A taser, you have neuromuscular incapacitation. This
Yeah.
doesn't have that. There's going to be no electricity that's going into your body whatsoever, but it's a pain compliance tool. So had they had this glove with George Floyd, would have been over.
Wow.
Kim Potter in Minnesota, the officer that accidentally mistook her firearm for a taser, and she shot and killed that suspect that was trying to flee in his car. Had she had the glove, that would have ended in 2 to 3 seconds.
The
So, we
only
wouldn't have had a dead suspect, and we wouldn't have had a police officer that went to prison.
I
So
see.
this is an unbelievable tool that is out there and available for law enforcement, corrections, and in the military to utilize to reduce liability, to be more effective. And one of the most important aspects of this is that it has better optics. We're not there punching, kicking, wrestling with somebody, beating them with batons. Force is never going to be pretty, but this is actually the least severe type of optic you'll ever see. All you have to do is have glove to skin contact, and you're going to have compliance. It's going to be over in 2 to 3 seconds.
You know,
guaranteed.
the only thing I could see is two things because cops are going to be cops. One is the only negative I could see tactically is you're going to be right up on that person, whereas a taser gives you some distance, and that's advantageous. Secondly, like I said, cops are cops, and I have to chuckle because I know what's going to happen. Hey, hey, Jeff, slap on the back. I mean,
Well, there's,
I,
the one thing is it's not meant to replace any of the tactics or anything
all
that you
right,
would do otherwise. It's just a tool to enhance your ability when you do have to go hands-on to be able to neutralize the bad actor more successfully than what we do with our current tools. And then the other thing is it has built-in accountability. It captures how when it's used, how many times it's been used, the duration of its use,
okay,
all of that stuff.
all
It's
right,
tracked. So that, if you want to abuse it, you're going to be held accountable to what
okay. I could
capturing on all the data.
I could just see some of the cops that tase themselves, that do stupid stuff to themselves. They're gonna zap themselves with this glove. I guarantee it. I know they will. But there's just yeah, but no, in theory, sounds great. It sounds anything that can help the cops out, and it does come down to optics as well. Hey, I'm all for it. So absolutely. All right, let's finish this up here. On Thin Ice, hopefully available in June. Where can people go to find you and find more about you and your book?
Well, the book, if you just go to Jeff Wenninger, and that's WENNINGER.com, that'll take you to the landing page. And you
Okay.
just put in your first and last name and your email, and you'll be put on the newsletter list. And that's an early, the early, the purchase of the book. And it soon will be actually an entire website that it'll take you to that.
Okay.
But you can also reach me on LinkedIn, Jeff Winninger on LinkedIn as well as Facebook. And
Okay.
I publish a lot of stuff. I do a lot of writing, and I publish um, uh, articles all over the country on law enforcement related issues. And you can see more about what I'm about, or you can go to Law Enforcement Consultants LLC, and you can go there and click on who we are and the services that we provide, and learn more about my company.
All right. I will put those in the show notes for everyone who wants to get a hold of you on Thin Ice. I hope it sells a million. I hope you do great. This has been a great conversation, Jeff. Thanks for being on the show.
Oh, thank you for having me. I enjoyed myself.